What's good, guys? So in this video you're gonna learn all there is to know about Bubble plugins. We have an action-packed content today and we're gonna be talking about introduction. What is a plugin? What can you do with plugins? We're gonna look at Bubble's own docs to see what they can tell us about building plugins for their platform. We are gonna talk about the plugin architecture. We're gonna look at different things that plugins can do, how to actually configure them, how to make them do the things that we want them to do. We're gonna have an overview of a working plugin. So we're gonna get a plugin from the Bubbles plugin store, we're gonna install it, we're gonna configure it, and we're gonna take a look at some of the internals of that plugin to better understand how it works. And then we're gonna go out and build a sample plugin so that you guys can ultimately understand deep inside how everything fits together. And then some final thoughts about plugins, what I like about them, what I don't like about them, just to leave you something. So what exactly is a plugin? Well, a quick way to kind of explain it, and this is the way that I understood it, this is the way that I internalized it, is a plugin essentially is like a mini Bubble app. It can do pretty much anything that an app can do, but it's self-contained. It's separate from your own app. You can install it, you can uninstall it, you can have functionality without the app, and then once you install the plugin, you get all of this functionality that a regular Bubble app has. All the features, all the capability, but with your own custom code, okay? And so anytime you need to add some kind of custom functionality to a Bubble app, you want to do the plugin. You want to go out and build your own plugin. Unfortunately, it's fairly simple and straightforward to build your own plugin. So if you Google for Bubble's plugin docs, you're gonna be on the screen that looks something like this. You can comment here, and so you can comment here, and you can take a look what plugins can do. Background services, API, authentication, element actions, stuff like that. Now, in order for you to kind of better understand the plugin architecture, I created this little diagram here. And this, in my mind, is one of the first things that I do whenever I learn about a new topic, and especially a topic as important as plugins. Because plugins is a relatively big topic. It's not like, building an element, putting an element. It's not like populating a repeating group or something like that. This is a relatively important topic. And this diagram really helps me to understand how it all fits together. And hopefully it's going to do the same for you. So if you look at all of this thing right here, this is a plugin. Okay, I know I have this thing here, but essentially all of this is a plugin. So the first thing that a plugin has, it has fields, and these are basically properties that you configure inside Bubble. Basically, when you double click on an element, and I'm going to show you when we start working with a sample plugin what exactly that I mean. But essentially, these are properties or props or fields. Bubble calls them fields. I think a better name would be properties or props, because in other programming languages, they're called props. And these are essentially things that a plugin inputs. These are things that, these are basically inputs inside the plugin. Because if you think about a plugin, it's basically like a function. It's basically like an object. It has data, it has various functions that operate on that data, and it has return values that essentially give you back various return values that you want. So after you gave it data, you gave it a bunch of functions that work on that data, it spits out back data that you can use in other workflows, in other elements, etc., etc. It's essentially like an object-oriented class or a big function or a big object. That's kind of the way you want to look at it. Next, we have exposed states, and these are really return values. Now, I don't know why Bubble calls them these weird names like fields, exposed states. These are essentially return values. So after a plugin finished doing its work and I need to display that data, I need to pass that data somewhere, I get its exposed states or return values, okay? Now, a plugin also has general properties. These are just different settings, its icon, its name, the type of elements it has, very, very simple things. So that's kind of the first thing. A plugin has API calls. So essentially, like you have with Bubble, you install that API plugin, which allows you to create API calls. A plugin can have its own API calls. So instead of creating API calls that are kind of part of the entire app that you're building, a plugin can have its own set of API calls, and these are important whenever you're building a plugin that needs to interface with a third party. So for instance, like a Stripe plugin. A Stripe plugin must have API calls, because if it doesn't have API calls, it's not going to do anything useful, because it needs to connect to the Stripe's server and, you know, send the credit card data, send the customer data. Otherwise, it's just not going to do anything. But not all plugins need to have API calls. There are a lot of plugins that don't need to have API calls because they can do all the calculations using various libraries that you provide. So this is obviously optional. And here I have a third-party API server. You can call this server here that we're connecting outbound, inbound. So it's going to send data, it's going to receive data, all that good stuff. Now, this is where a lot of people get confused, okay? A plugin, according to Bubble, has something called events and something called actions. And this initially confused me as well. And what events are essentially triggers, okay? So a plugin is doing something and then it sends a trigger, meaning it sends an event, sends a trigger that it has finished doing something. And it has, you know, maybe it's done something successfully, maybe it failed, but it finished doing something. And this is useful in asynchronous situations, meaning that you have a workflow and you're doing, you know, step A, step B, step C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. But in many cases, you cannot rely on the plugin to do something right away. It needs to do it on its own time and space and basically sends you an event back asynchronously, meaning out of sequence when it's done doing something. And that's the case with Stripe, because with Stripe you send data and Stripe is not going to do it right away. It's not going to be synchronous. Maybe it's busy, maybe it's doing something else. And then, you know, when it's done, and this could be in 2 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, you know, usually it's around like 10 seconds, 15 seconds, it's going to send you back a response with, you know, whether that credit card that we sent was charged successfully or not. And that's an asynchronous event. So in this case, it's a trigger. It also has something called actions. And these are basically synchronous functions. So, you know, if you're doing something, you got some data from the customer, from the user, and you need to do some kind of calculation on that data, that's not going to be asynchronous. You can do it right away. It's not dependent on something else. You know, it's something that could be done right away. In this case, it's an action. So essentially, this initiates a new workflow, and this is part of an existing workflow. That's kind of the way you want to think about it, all right? So we have general props, we have input values, we have output values, we have API stuff, we have things that trigger a workflow, and we have things that are not, they don't trigger a workflow. They're kind of like in the middle of a workflow or the end of a workflow, if you think about it. But these are never going to be in the beginning of a workflow, where these are going to be in the beginning of a workflow. So I really hope a lot of this makes sense to you. You can kind of take a look. You can pause the video and have another look at this diagram. But right now, when we go and look at a sample plugin and how to implement it and how all of these pieces fit in, you're gonna have a much better understanding of how things work. So here I have a brand new Bubble app. This is a brand new app. It's a blank screen. I'm not using any templates. I'm not using any headers, footers, or anything like that. And what I want to show you is how a sample plugin works. And the plugin that I'm gonna choose, it's gonna work with a lot of these things that we just talked about, which is gonna give you a really good understanding of how everything fits together. Because this is nice and all, but me personally, I need to see it in action. I'm kind of a visual learner, maybe you are too. And I kind of need to see how it works in real world, all right? So here we have an app, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go into plugins, we're gonna hit add plugins. And the plugin that I'm gonna install is a plugin that does a search on an input field, gets the data from some data source or a table in your Bubble database or whatever, and displays it. And it displays this data as you're typing. It's kind of a autocomplete, fuzzy search kind of thing, and you can just search for it. It's called Fuzzy, and the plugin here is ZQ Fuzzy Search and Autocomplete. It has almost 14,000 installs, so it's a pretty popular plugin. We're gonna hit install. We're gonna hit done here. And now we're gonna take a look, and there's nothing here. You can kind of read about it. This is always useful. And you can kind of learn about it. You can kind of read what they tell you. They're not telling you a whole lot here, and that is why I'm gonna tell you how it works. But sometimes they do tell you a lot. So we're gonna go back to the design. And right away, we have this element here. We have a visual element. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna drag it here. Now, typically the way these plugins are done is that we have this visual element. This is the plugin, okay? This is the plugin. It's not gonna be visible when we run the app. It's not gonna be visible. It's kind of like a piece of code that's there, but we can kind of work with it. We can interface with it. That's kind of the purpose, but it's not gonna be something that the user is gonna be interfacing directly. And once we drag it, we have this appearance. Now, all of these fields, these are essentially this thing here. These are the fields and props. And when we go into the the plugin configuration, you're gonna see it as fields. These are essentially props. So if we go back to our app, we can configure it. So this plugin essentially pulls data depending on what we type in another field, depending on the value of another field. Okay, so we're gonna be doing customers. Okay, we're gonna create a table of customers. Customer is gonna have a name, email, etc., etc. So that is why for the data type, we're gonna specify customers. Now, I already went ahead and created this table here. I'm gonna show you exactly how it looks, but now we can configure it. So we have data type is customers. Data source is gonna be do a search for customers. We don't have any constraints or anything. And now it's telling us a field to search. So it needs to have at least one field to search. So once we tell it customers here, it understands what customers is. So once we tell it customers, the data type is customers. This is kind of why I like Bubble so much, is that right away it knows a lot about that data, right? And even if this was like an external API, you could still do it, because once you make that first call, Bubble understands all the fields. And this is really one of the powers of Bubble, if you will. This is one of the kind of the big things that makes a lot of things very, very easy, is that it's very data type aware. So we have a data type customers. We're gonna say search by name. If you had other fields you wanna search by, you can do that. Now, this is all of the required fields that we need. You can fill it out by other fields, so you can search by name, email, or name or email, etc., etc. But we're just gonna keep it simple, just search by one of the fields. Now, what's interesting about this plugin is that you can have text here that's gonna search it against, or you can get this text as an input from another field, which is what we're gonna be doing here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drag another input here, okay? And this is gonna be our search field. This is where we're gonna type the name of the field here. So we're gonna call this search box. And you have your placeholder, you have your all the other things. Now, what you guys wanna do is, in order to get this plugin to work, and really, when you're building plugins having to do with kind of input fields, this is always good practice. You want to go into settings, and you want to find this property here, this setting, if you will, expose the option to add an ID attribute to HTML elements. You want to check that option. That way, when you're creating these HTML elements, and that's all they are, HTML elements, you can actually specify it, which is important in this case. It's not going to be important when you're just building a regular app, but if you're doing plugins and you need to reference that element, this is a good thing to have. So we're going to go back to the design, we're going to double click here, and if we scroll down, we have this ID attribute. If you do not set that setting, you're not going to have this here, and that way it's not going to, you won't be able to get it working correctly. So if you go, so let's label this ID attribute here. We're going to say this is our search box. Now we have an ID attribute that's set. If we go back here and we double click, we can set this option here, and this is or set text to match from an input box. We're gonna set, and then we have to fill in the input box ID. And in this case, this is gonna be search box, because this is the ID of this field here, okay? So we set it here. Now, this plugin is able to get data, okay? It's able to get data. So this plugin, so if we go back here, this plugin, this is the input props. We are feeding it into the plugin. We're still not getting data back. We're still not using, triggers and actions and all that stuff. We're not getting data back. So what we need to do, guys, is we need to display that data somewhere. You could do it any way you want. You could do it as an API call, like externally. You can do it as a workflow. You can do it as anything you want. But we're gonna keep it simple. We're just gonna display it here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drag and drop a repeating group. Okay, we're gonna expand it, make it a little bit bigger, something like this. And I'm gonna drag and drop a column, right? So this is gonna be a text here. I'm gonna drag it up right here. Okay, and you can do multiple. And I'm just gonna have one column just to show you. Actually, let's have 2 columns just to make it a little bit nicer, okay? Now, the first column is gonna be the name. The second column is gonna be the email of the customer that we're searching for. So we're gonna come here, we're gonna say insert dynamic data. And the first thing we wanna do is, obviously, before we even do that, actually, we wanna go to this repeating group, we wanna double click, and we wanna set the type of content. This is kind of the power of Bubble, as I just said just a couple of minutes ago. You wanna tell Bubble about the type of content you're dealing with, and Bubble is gonna help you out. So we're gonna say type of content is gonna be customers. Okay? Data source is gonna be do a search for customers. Okay? Now, if you come in here, you can do insert dynamic data, current sales customers name. It knows about customers. We haven't gotten the data back. We haven't gotten the actual data, but that's fine because it knows to expect customers, and customers have a name. They have an email, as I'm going to show you in a second. So if we come here, we're going to do customers, and actually we don't have an email. We just have names. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to data, and I'm going to go to customers, and that's our data here, and this is our data type. So right now we only have a name. So let's create an email as well. Email, and this is going to be text. Okay, email text. Now, if we go back to app data, we can actually modify this one. So let's say this is, the name is Robert. I'm just going to say robert@gmail.com. That's probably taken, but it's a good email, right? Tom is going to be tom@gmail.com. All right. And then we have James. So we have 3 customers. This is going to be james@gmail.com. That's a great email to have. All right. So now, if we go to the app data here, we have 3 customers here, right? We have Robert, Tom, and James. And this is all there, kind of like, if we take a look, we have email set, we have all of these things set. And obviously, I can also display the email by clicking these 2 additional fields. I can just say, okay, we want email displayed there as well. And now the email and the name is displayed, all right? Now, we have our data here. We're going to go back to the design. And remember, guys, always think in your mind, what have you done so far? So far, we are feeding in the input. We're not displaying the output. So if I come in here, we have one issue, and that is because we haven't configured this email. So if I double click here, we're in the customer's email, okay? So now it's gonna be displaying the name and the email, but it's not gonna do anything right now because we haven't linked it, right? What we haven't done is we haven't linked that repeating group to the exposed states or return values, as I like to call it. So we're gonna go back, we're gonna come in here, we're gonna double click, and the data source is not search for customers anymore, right? We need to clear this, and what we need to do is we need to click, and we're gonna go in here, search and correct A. This is that plugin there, that is what it's called. And then we have these return values. We're gonna say matches, okay? And it knows it's customers, and that is why all of this is configured correctly. It's not broken or anything like that. And now, when we type something here, this is gonna understand that the data we're typing here is the data that is gonna go out and it's gonna fetch the data and it's gotta display it here. So let's try it out. We're gonna hit preview, and this is kind of what we're seeing. So if I type Tom, right away Tom is displayed. If I type Rob, Rob is displayed. If I type James, James is displayed. There it is. That's the plugin. That's how you configure the plugin. Now, let's go inside the plugin and let me show you how they configured it so that you have even a better understanding. This is a very, very good thing to do. So if you go here to the plugin tab, we have this plugin page here. You want to click on that. And now you're seeing this kind of plugin page. You want to hit see plugin code. And now we have this plugin here. So the tabs here are roughly corresponding to kind of what we talked about here. Fields, exposed values, all of this stuff to some extent, right? So if you go to shared, you see, your shared stuff, right? The kind of stuff that it's using some JavaScript libraries, right? Because they're doing some of the logic in their own libraries, and that's fine. It doesn't have any API calls because it doesn't need to. Now it has an element. This is the element. This is the plugin, essentially, kind of the element, because this is the plugin. Now this is where a lot of the magic happens. Okay, we have general properties. Okay, we have an icon. You can choose an icon. Now all of this is read-only, right? Because this is not our plugin. This is their plugin. But what's nice about Bubble is that it gives us this screen, so we can kind of see some of the internal workings of a plugin. So we have Bubble properties. You could set properties, default dimensions. It's 32 by 32 of that element. It's a little square. Now we have the fields. Now we're getting to the good stuff. So if you click on fields here, we have the input field. So this should be called input fields or property fields. I don't know why they call it, like, the naming is just terrible. Like, that is something they gotta fix, because fields is such a generic term. They should call it like input data or input fields or properties. So these are input fields. Okay, it wants a data type, it wants a data source, it wants the first field. These three are not optional. You see how the optional is not checked? It's not checked. And then we have other fields, and these are all optional. Okay, optional, 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 optional. And then we have, if you want to set another field as the input to the data to be searched, we have a field here. So if you go back here, if you go to our app here and you double click this plugin, this is what's being displayed. This is the input field. This is the way you configure the plugin. Okay, I don't know, what did they call it? I keep forgetting. Like, it's such a ridiculous name. Fields. It's such a generic name. And this is kind of what they have. So a couple of things they're doing is this data source is a list, right? This data source is a list, because if we go back here, we have here, and this becomes a list. Okay, this data source here, data type. Bubble understands if you tell a data type, it's gonna display your data types. Okay, it understands data source is a list, right? It's not in a field because it needs a list of things to search through. Okay, so if we go back, we have all of this. This is kind of self-explanatory, and essentially we're grabbing data that we can pass to our internal function that's gonna be doing the searching. Okay, we have exposed states, another great name, sarcastically. And this is basically your return values. We have a match array, we have a match scores array, things that were matched, match scores 0 to 1, so I'm not using this. And we have input box value. This is the value of input box from the ID. So this is probably going to be the value here. Okay, so it's returning it, which is nice, but we already know that value, right? We already know this value, but in some cases, this is useful because you can say something like you searched for, and you can type, use this value here, and this is the results we got. So for instance, instead of just having this repeating group, I can have something like you searched for, and I can use the value from the plugin instead of the value from here, which is going to be more reliable because the plugin knows the value, right? This is kind of what you can use. Okay, next we have events. These events trigger workflows, and this is essentially this thing. This is a trigger, and then we have functions. And if we scroll down, they're calling it element actions. Okay, these are functions. So these things trigger, and these things are kind of in the middle of your workflow. So this could be like an asynchronous trigger. So for instance, like we're doing something and we just wait, and then like 10 seconds later we have a trigger. So we don't have any triggers, and here we have one action, and this allows us to reset the input. Okay. And then we have various element code, and this is where you need to add a little bit of code. Not a lot, just a little bit. So we have your initializer. This essentially initializes our plugin. So if you think about a plugin as a box with a bunch of properties that we need to set initially, this thing does it. Okay, this essentially does it, right? We have your instance. Instance is that plugin that we're working with, right? We're resetting the result to blank, right? Because we have a result and we need to get another result, so we need to reset it. We set it to blank, and then we can start working with another result. We have an update, right? This thing is called whenever a field or value changes, and this is very useful for us because we are essentially working with data that's changing, right? So you need to kind of define this thing here. And this is kind of a piece of JavaScript. And I don't want to go too deep into it. This is kind of a no-code channel. But if you guys are interested, I'm going to go deeper into kind of the JavaScript, because I've been doing JavaScript for a long time. And JavaScript is useful. It's very, very useful for building UI apps, apps that interface with the user. Anytime you need to do something on the client side, JavaScript is very useful. So if you want me to talk more about JavaScript, let me know in the comments below, and I'll be happy to kind of give you a little bit of a preview, an intro, if you will, an intro tutorial. So we have a JavaScript that happens when the field changes, okay? Next, we scroll down, we have other initializer. And what is an initializer? Initializer is a function that needs to be run, that's ran first. So when we define an element, you have an initializer, and the initializer can set the various element properties to certain values, or it can just set it to blanks. But it's important, because without an initializer, you don't know what it's set to. It could be set to some random value, it could be set to a value that was set previously. So initializer is very important. That way we have predictability. So that is very important. So we have initializer, but we're not using these functions. All we're doing is doing this reset input. And the reason we have this reset input is that if you scroll up, we have an action, element action reset input. That is the only reason we have this. If we add another action, it's gonna create another input box for us to, put in that function there, to kind of define the function, if you will. So in this case, we are setting all of these 3 return values, and Bubble calls them exposed states. Man, I really hate that name. And we are setting these return values to null. That is kind of what we're doing. We are resetting our return values. That is kind of what we're doing. And that's kind of all you have. That is all you have. So hopefully this will allow you to configure very, very easily, very quickly any plugin, because one of the problems with Bubble's plugins is that they give you plugins, but they don't really tell you how to configure it. I'm always hunting for documentation. I'm always trying to figure out how it works. But now that you know kind of the architecture of plugins and where to find all that stuff, I mean, you can quickly take a look. You can go to exposed states and you can see, okay, so it's returning this data. And the fields, you can look at it here, but you're gonna see the fields anyway, right? You're gonna see it when you're configuring. You're gonna see them here. And then you can take a look at your events. Okay, it has a trigger, so maybe it's asynchronous. Okay, maybe I need to be aware of that. It has actions. Oh, great. So a bunch of functions I can use in my workflows. Great. It's all here. And last but not least, you can look at API calls, right? No API calls, but maybe there are API calls. Okay, great. I can issue API calls. So this is very, very useful when you do not have extensive documentation. And moreover, I'm the kind of person that always likes to look at the source code. For me, source code is better than any documentation. It's better than any book. It's better than, anything that's apart from the actual code. I always look at the code. I'm that kind of person. If you're like this, then you're going to find this very, very useful. If you're not, you kind of have to go out and hunt for various tutorials, see, all the things that people have already done, official tutorials, unofficial tutorials, things like that. All right, so now let's go ahead and create a sample plugin just to show you how things work. So here I am back in Bubble, and this is the My Apps tab. If I go into My Plugins, I can create a new plugin. So I'm gonna hit New Plugin. I'm just gonna call it Test Plugin. I know that's very, very original, right? So now we have the plugin, and now we can kind of start building what we wanted to build. Now this is going to be a very, very simple plugin. I'm not going to do anything super complicated. What it's going to do is going to make an API call to a third-party service. So we're going to go to API calls. We're going to first Google for free API. So you can just Google for something like free API tests or free test APIs. There's a lot of them. And if we scroll down, there's a lot of interesting APIs, and I found this Data USA API. So if we copy this link right here, and I put it into my tool here, that essentially shows me what this API returns, and I execute it, this is the data I get. So it looks like it's United States population. So here's for the year 2019, 2018, 2017, and the population is 328 million, 327 million, 318 million. So it's constantly growing. So this looks like it's the right data. So this is what we're going to be getting. So we're going to copy that URL. We're going to go back to our plugin, and we're going to create a new API, and this is going to be called US population API. We're going to do add another call, and we're going to say get population, get US population, something like this. We're going to paste that here. You want to make sure that this is data, okay? If you have it as action, it's going to execute something and you're not going to get any data back. This is data right now. And this is kind of what we have. We're going to initialize call to make sure we're getting data. So when we initialize call, it tells us that the query must contain at least one measure. So let's double check. Yeah, this is what we want to do. We want to drill down nation, measures, population. Okay, so we're going to go back, paste this, reinitialize call, and now we're getting a list. We're getting a list here. Now you want to make sure you're getting a list. If you're going to be displaying it in a repeating group, it needs to be a list. Otherwise, it's not going to work correctly. This data field, right? So if we go back to my little app here, we have this data thing here. It's an object with a data as an array of different objects. And this is great because we can just focus on this data property here. So we're going to go back. We're going to hit save. The next thing is you want to do, you want to go to elements and you want to create a new element. We're going to call this element 1 or, you know, whatever, test element. We're going to hit OK. You can select a category, whether it's going to be a visual element or an input form. I'm going to select a visual element. We're going to select an icon. How about this bicycle here? And we're going to select the default width. I'm just going to make it something small, 32. You can set it to whatever you want. And that's about it. We're not going to do anything else. We're not going to have events, actions, or anything else like that. Now, the next thing you want to do is you want to make sure you put your app that you're going to be testing with. We're not going to be publishing this plugin. We're going to just be testing it with our own app, right? So if I go back to Bubble and I'm going to go back to my apps, I have an app that I'm going to be testing. This is this app right here, this search input test. So if I open this app, it's a blank app. It's going to be super ideal for testing. And so what you want to do is you want to copy this name of the app and you want to go back and you want to paste it here. Now, whenever you're developing this plugin, you're changing, maybe you want to add events, you want to add actions, you want to add other things. You're going to be coming here and this way it's going to load your app with the new plugin. So you don't need to constantly upgrade the plugin or find the plugin in the Bubble marketplace or anything like that. So if I hit this, it's gonna load my app along with the plugin already there, right? So this is my new app. And if I go to the plugins, it should display the plugin. This is this test plugin here, okay? And it's telling me that there's one element and it's doing one data call, which is kind of cool. So if we go to the design, and remember, we set it as a visual element. You want to drag this plugin right here. And there's the plugin there. So that's it. It's not configurable. It's not doing anything. It's just gonna execute that call for us, all right? So now you want to drag and drop a repeating group in order to display this data that we're getting, right? So we're gonna put it here, maybe center it, whatever. We're gonna say type of content is gonna be data, right? You want to focus on the data because that is a list, and a repeating group expects a list. This is not gonna work. I don't know what source is, but I know data is a list, so we're gonna do that. Data source, we're gonna say get data from an external API. We're gonna say that, and we're gonna say data. Now it's a list, everything checks out. Next, we're gonna drag and drop a text to display something. This is the first one, and this is the second one. Maybe display 2 columns. So if I select this text, I double click it, insert dynamic data. We're gonna choose this first option, and we're gonna say nation. That should be US. Double click, dynamic data, and we're gonna say population. All right, so all of this stuff, guys, you gotta understand that all of this, the fact that we have this API, the fact if you double click, or rather double click here and we have this type of content, that's because our plugin allows it. Otherwise, if we don't have the plugin, you wouldn't have this data type. That's what the plugin is doing, okay? So we're gonna come in here, and now when we run it, it's gonna go ahead and it's gonna execute the calls that our plugin is responsible for. So I'm gonna hit preview and let's see what happens. And now as you can see, the data is shown. We have United States and we have the populations. You can also display year, etc., etc. And all of this is done by our plugin. So if we go back to our plugin here and we go to the API calls, this is the API call that becomes available as a data type. Okay, if we set it as an action, then we can use it inside our workflow to trigger that specific workflow. It no longer will be a data type, because an action does not return a data type. It's a way to execute something. When we use it as data, we now have access to this data type. And like I said, there's so many things you can do with plugins. You can create multiple elements, you can do actions, add an action here, you can do events, you can expose states, fields, all of this stuff. Remember this diagram that I think is really gonna help you out when you are out there building plugins. All right, guys, so that is all that I wanted to cover in today's video. I truly hope you've gotten value here. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns that I can cover in a future video. Let me know if you have suggestions for future content. And more than anything, let me know what kind of problems you're struggling with so that I can go out and I can make the right content to solve the kind of problems you're having. I really hope you've gotten value here. Now, if you did get value here, make sure you give this video a fat thumbs up. Leave a comment just letting me know what you think about this video, and definitely subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet already. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you real soon.